We're having a coat and sweater day again in Santa Fe. Winter's made a brief return. We even had a little snow this morning, but most of that's melted in the sun. But it's still only in the upper 30s. Hopefully back into at least the 50s tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly when I noticed it, but whenever I wrote or talked about traditional religious topics, church, theology, Bible, I was getting less and less response to them. Comments, affirmations, criticism, whatever, just nothing. Now, one exception I can think of within the last few years was when I preached a sermon in which I said Jesus did not walk on water. And one member of the congregation was very upset about that. But that story stands out because it's so rare. And indeed, when other people heard about her reaction, most people shrugged their shoulders and said, "What was the big deal?" I've gradually come to the conclusion that most people, even in the church, don't really care very much about Christianity's traditional teachings and practices. Beliefs, doctrines, theology, creeds, liturgy, interpreting the Bible, even Jesus, all seem to get kind of a shoulder shrug. Now, when asked, people will say that they're important, but I've found that their behavior usually doesn't support that. Very few people anymore read the Bible or study theology. From the questions I'll ask, I know that most people really don't even know some of the most primary basics of Christian doctrine. They remember little beyond what they were taught in Sunday school or confirmation. Now, this has been very upsetting for pastors because I know I'm not the only one that's recognized this. And I spent many my early years trying to get people fired up about such things through Bible studies and other kind of book groups and in my sermons and so on. But as time has gone on, I've come to the conclusion it's probably not really worth the struggle. And this recording is a way for me to tell you it's okay that you don't care. Your gut instinct is pretty on target, that this stuff is not all that important and probably not worth much of your time to try to learn about it. We've just finished the Passion and Resurrection liturgical drama of Holy Week and Easter. This is the biggest big deal of the church year, and its basic teachings and ideas are at the center of Christianity. We're told repeatedly in various ways that these were earth-shaking events, historic. The world's never the same since. There's some truth to that. But in sermons, when you hear that Jesus' death and resurrection are vitally important to your life, most of the time I find pastors struggling to really explain why that is. They just assert that it's true and that we all ought to believe it. Now, I'm not going to repeat what I've written and said about these stories and traditions in my recent videos and blog posts. You can find those all over the last few weeks if you're interested. And it does help, I think, to have a more realistic picture of those events to the extent that we can figure that out. But again, you may not really care about that, and that's okay too. The reality is that ancient events are, in fact, just stories from the past. Stories that we really have no idea or very little idea how accurately they're portrayed. And that goes even for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Such events are really only of value if they can speak meaningfully about life and about our world today. That has been increasingly difficult for the ancient religions of the world. I've said before in a few different places that all of the ancient religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all really past their sell-by date. They're getting pretty stale. They were developed in a different time, and they were developed for the people of a different world. And those religions are inevitably distorted when they're adapted for today. And that's true of Christianity as well. Most of them simply don't work as religions because religion itself is passing away. It just doesn't fit in the world in which we live. All the priests and temples and rituals and worship liturgies and scriptures, the creeds, the beliefs, that just doesn't work for us today as they used to do for pre-modern people. But usually we miss that the founders of those religions and many of their greatest teachers often, in fact, were not very interested in religion per se. The Buddha's Great Noble Truths begin with the task of recognizing that life is suffering, and most of his work is dedicated to how we can live and overcome that suffering. Hinduism is mostly concerned with living a good life. The Old Testament says our goal is to be at peace with God and with our neighbor. The Old Testament in particular calls out religion oftentimes as simply being a distraction. There are places where it says you don't need a king, which was, of course, really the head of Israel tradition. You don't need a temple. God says, I'm perfectly happy with the tent that we have right now. And the prophets rail against all of the religion, all of the rituals and sacrifices. Just live justly, they say. That's what's important. When asked, Jesus says the great commandment is to love God with your heart, soul, and mind. Again, echoing the Old Testament, the Hebrew tradition. And he said, a second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments, he says, depends all the law and the prophets. That's it. That's what we need to do. I'm not saying that's easy, but in terms of what our goal is, there you've got it. In John, the Gospel of John, Jesus says about himself, I came that people would have life and have it abundantly. I think that's really the only meaningful goal for any religious or spiritual tradition or practice. Learning how it is that we can live life to the full and do it in a way that has us at peace with all around us. Thanks for watching. Hope you tune in again soon.